Margaret Anderson had always considered her life to be stable. At 42, she was a woman who prided herself on her independence, her dignity, and her unwavering sense of self. Her marriage to Richard had, over time, transformed from a passionate whirlwind into a calm partnership, marked more by companionship than romance. Their son Ben was grown and living on his own, and Margaret often thought of herself as entering a new phase of life, a phase where she could finally focus on herself. That illusion was shattered one Sunday evening when Richard sat her down at the dining table, his face pale and his hands trembling. Margaret had assumed it was work stress or perhaps something trivial he'd built up in his mind, but when he spoke, his words hit her like a freight train. "I need to tell you something," he began. "I've met someone else." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's first instinct was to laugh, not out of amusement, but because the absurdity of his words seemed too surreal. After all, wasn't this the kind of thing that happened to other people? To younger couples? To those who were unhappy. But not to them. Not after decades of marriage. "You love someone else," she finally managed to say, her voice calm but distant. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "Her name is Clara. I never meant for this to happen, Margaret. But I love her. I really do." Oddly, Margaret didn't feel the anger she thought she should. She didn't throw a glass across the room or demand an explanation. Instead, she felt a strange kind of numbness, as though her emotions had been packed away in a box she didn't want to open. Their marriage had been more functional than passionate for years, and though she still cared for Richard, she realized she wasn't entirely surprised. They had grown apart in ways neither of them wanted to admit. But one thing still stung. "What about us?" she asked. "What about Ben?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I don't want to hurt you or him. I need to figure out what I want." Margaret didn't cry that night. Instead, she went to bed early, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced. She had never thought of herself as someone who would let her life fall apart, but now, faced with the unraveling of her marriage, she wasn't sure what to do. In the weeks that followed, Margaret maintained her composure. She and Richard continued to live under the same roof, though the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. They even went on a planned vacation together, pretending for Ben's sake that everything was fine. But Margaret knew the facade wouldn't last forever. When they returned from the trip, Richard did something unexpected. He asked Margaret if she would meet Clara. "She wants to talk to you," he said, his voice cautious. "She says it's important. She doesn't want to keep sneaking around, and she feels like she owes you an explanation." Margaret stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or scream. The audacity of it all. Her husband's mistress asking for a meeting as if this were some sort of business negotiation was almost comical. And yet, curiosity gnawed at her. Who was this woman who had captured Richard's heart? What did she want from her? Against her better judgment, Margaret agreed. They met at a quiet cafe in town, a neutral place where no one would recognize them. When Margaret saw Clara, she was struck by how ordinary she looked. Clara was in her mid-30s with soft brown hair and warm hazel eyes. There was nothing flashy or overtly seductive about her. If anything, she reminded Margaret of a younger version of herself. "Thank you for meeting me," Clara said nervously as they sat down. "I wasn't sure you'd agree." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her expression neutral. "I'm not sure why I did. But I'm here. Say what you need to say." Clara hesitated, then began to speak. She told Margaret about how she had met Richard at a mutual friend's party, how their connection had been instant and overwhelming. She admitted that she hadn't planned for this to happen, and that she was deeply ashamed of the pain she had caused. "I know I've ruined your family," Clara said, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I know you probably hate me. But I need you to understand. I love him. I love him in a way I've never loved anyone before." Margaret felt a strange sense of detachment as she listened. She had expected to hate Clara, to see her as a manipulative homewrecker. But the woman sitting across from her wasn't a villain. She was just human. Vulnerable. Conflicted. Margaret didn't know whether to pity her or despise her. "You say you love him," Margaret said finally. "But what do you want from me? What do you expect me to do?" Clara hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee cup. "I don't want to take him away from you," she said. "I know he's happy with you. I don't want to lose him either." The words hung in the air and Margaret couldn't help but laugh bitterly. So you want me to stay married to him to keep him stable while you carry on your affair? That's quite the arrangement. Clara's face turned red. No, that's not what I mean. I don't know what to do. I feel so lost. For the first time, Margaret saw the cracks in Clara's composure. She wasn't the confident seductress Margaret had imagined. She was just a woman in over her head. And in that moment, Margaret felt something unexpected. Empathy. After the meeting, Margaret spent days replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Clara's tearful face or the raw emotion in her voice. But more than that, she couldn't ignore the realization that Richard's betrayal wasn't entirely about Clara. Their marriage had been faltering long before she entered the picture. One evening, as she and Richard sat in the living room, Margaret finally broke the silence. I met her, she said. Richard looked up from his book, his face guarded. And she's not what I expected, Margaret admitted. She's not the villain I thought she'd be. Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. She's not. But that doesn't excuse what I've done. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. Richard, I don't know if I can forgive you. But I also don't know if I want to keep doing this, living in this limbo. What are you saying? He asked, his voice tight. I'm saying we need to make a decision, Margaret said. Either we fight for this marriage or we end it. But I can't live in between anymore. Richard spent the next few days avoiding Margaret, but when he finally returned to the conversation, he came with a decision. I want to fix this, he said. I want to fix us. Margaret was skeptical but agreed to try couples therapy. For weeks, they worked through years of resentment, miscommunication, and emotional distance. The sessions were painful and raw, but they forced both of them to confront truths they had long ignored. Meanwhile, Clara faded into the background. Richard cut off contact with her, though Margaret suspected it wasn't easy for him. She didn't ask about her, choosing instead to focus on the fragile rebuilding of their marriage. Months later, Margaret and Richard stood on more solid ground. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than it had been in years. They had learned to communicate, to address their needs and fears without hiding behind silence. As for Clara, she remained a shadow of the past, a painful reminder of what they had almost lost. Margaret didn't hate her, but she didn't pity her either. She had made her choices just as Margaret and Richard had made theirs. In the end, Margaret found peace not in revenge or anger, but in reclaiming her own life. She had survived betrayal and come out stronger, more self-assured, and more determined to live on her own terms. Whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with grace and resilience. And that was enough. The months following Margaret and Richard's decision to rebuild their marriage were filled with equal parts effort and doubt. Therapy had helped them address their long-standing issues, but Margaret couldn't ignore the faint echoes of betrayal that lingered in her mind. Every time Richard's phone buzzed, she fought the instinct to question him. Every time he stayed late at work, she had to suppress the anxiety that gnawed at her insides. Richard, for his part, was trying. He made a conscious effort to be more present, cooking dinner, planning weekend outings, even texting her little notes during the day like he used to when they were newlyweds. But Margaret couldn't tell if his actions came from genuine remorse or a sense of obligation. Was he doing this because he truly wanted to fix their marriage, or because it was the right thing to do? The cracks were most visible when they were with their son, Ben. During family dinners, Richard would act as though nothing had changed, laughing and joking as if they were still the happy family they had always pretended to be. Margaret would force a smile, playing along for Ben's sake, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were putting on a performance. One evening after Ben had left, Margaret confronted Richard. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart racing. Richard looked up from his glass of wine, caught off guard. "Margaret, I told you, I ended things with Clara." "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked if you still think about her." Richard hesitated, and in that moment, Margaret saw the truth in his eyes. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. "But it doesn't mean I don't want to be here with you." Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She appreciated his honesty, but it only deepened the divide between them. How could they rebuild their marriage when part of his heart still lingered with someone else? Despite Richard's efforts to cut ties with Clara, she remained a lingering presence in their lives. Margaret would occasionally hear her name in passing, through mutual acquaintances or whispers in town. Clara had returned to her husband, but Margaret doubted the stability of their arrangement. After all, Clara had made it clear during their meeting that she didn't love him. One afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected email. It was from Clara. Subject: I'm sorry. Hi Margaret. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry for everything. For hurting you, for disrupting your family, for putting you in a position you never deserved to be in. I've been trying to fix things in my own life, but I can't shake the guilt I feel for what I did to you. If there's ever anything I can do to make things right, please let me know. I'll respect your decision if you'd rather never hear from me again. Take care. Clara ***. Margaret stared at the email, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion and, much to her surprise, curiosity. Why had Clara reached out now? Was this an attempt at closure, or was she trying to absolve herself of guilt? After hours of deliberation, Margaret decided to reply. Subject: I'm sorry. Clara. Thank you for your apology. I'm not sure what to say, to be honest. I'm still trying to make sense of everything that happened, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why it happened in the first place. I don't hate you, but I also don't think I can forgive you, not yet at least. What I do want is for you to let us move on. Please respect that. Margaret ***. Sending the email felt like closing a door, a small but significant step toward reclaiming her peace. Whether Clara respected her wishes or not, Margaret was determined to move forward. Margaret's world took an unexpected turn when her son, Ben, finally discovered the truth about his father's affair. He had come over for dinner one evening, his mood noticeably somber. After the meal, he pulled Margaret aside, his expression serious. Mom, he said, I ran into someone at work today. She said she knows Dad. Margaret's heart sank. Who? Clara, Ben said, his voice tight. She didn't say much, but it wasn't hard to put the pieces together. Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping. Ben, I didn't want you to find out like this. I'm not a kid, Mom, he said. I can handle the truth. What I can't handle is watching you pretend everything's fine when I know it's not. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to burden you with this. You have your own life to focus on. Mom, you don't have to protect me, Ben said. But you do need to protect yourself. Are you really happy with Dad? Or are you just staying because it's easier than starting over? The question hit Margaret like a lightning bolt. She had been so focused on repairing her marriage for the sake of their family that she hadn't stopped to ask herself what she truly wanted. Was she staying because she loved Richard or because she was afraid to let go of the life they had built? Margaret's conversation with Ben lingered in her mind for days. It forced her to confront feelings she had been burying for months. Feelings of resentment, loneliness, and an undeniable sense that she deserved more. One evening, as she and Richard sat in the living room, she finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. Richard, she said, her voice steady, I don't think this is working. He looked up, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? I mean us, Margaret said. I thought I could move past what happened. I thought we could rebuild. But the truth is, I don't think I can forgive you. And even if I could, I don't think I'd ever trust you again. Richard's face fell. Margaret, I've been trying. I want to fix this. I know you've been trying, she said. And I appreciate it. But sometimes trying isn't enough. We're not the same people we were when we got married, Richard. And I think it's time we accept that. The room was silent for a long moment before Richard finally nodded. If this is what you want, he said quietly, then I'll respect it. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. The months following their separation were both challenging and liberating for Margaret. She moved into a smaller house, one that felt cozy and entirely her own. She rediscovered hobbies she had long abandoned: painting, gardening, even joining a book club. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living for herself instead of for someone else. Ben visited often, and their relationship grew stronger as they navigated this new chapter together. He even encouraged Margaret to try dating again, though she wasn't ready just yet. As for Richard, he remained a part of Margaret's life in a limited capacity, mostly for Ben's sake. They were cordial, even friendly at times, but Margaret kept her boundaries firm. She didn't regret her decision to leave him. It had been the first step toward reclaiming her happiness. One day, as she sat in her garden sipping tea, Margaret realized something profound. She wasn't angry anymore. The pain of betrayal had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She had survived heartbreak, navigated the complexities of forgiveness, and come out stronger on the other side. Margaret smiled, the sunlight warming her face. For the first time in a long time she felt truly free. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was more than enough.